Good evening. Welcome to the Clabaugh Speaker Series this evening. My name is Dennis Ritchie. I'm a member of the Clabaugh Speaker Series Committee this year. And so it's my opportunity to introduce our speaker this evening. I would remind you that Ben and Geraldine Clabaugh left an endowment with the church to establish this speaker series with the purpose of deepening Christian discipleship in members of First Presbyterian Church as well as our community. I would ask you at this point to look at your telephone and make sure it is off or silenced so that it won't go off. I would also like to say that this is not Sunday morning. You don't have to sit in your usual pew. You could actually come down front because Eric might get up and walk to you. But in the future, come down front. I've watched via the Zoom, and it looks like nobody's here, and there are actually people here. Our speaker this year is Reverend Dr. Eric Barreto. He is the Frederick and Margaret Weyerhaeuser, as in Weyerhaeuser Lumber, Associate Professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary. He earned his BA from Oklahoma Baptist University, his MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary, and his PhD in New Testament from Emory University. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce Reverend Dr. Eric Barreto.
Thank you, Dennis, and good evening, friends. It is delightful to see you all. Thank you for coming out this evening to talk a little bit about the shape of salvation in the Gospel of Luke. We can get the first slide. That'd be awesome. In the church where I grew up, salvation was narrow. It was particular. Salvation meant what happened to you the moment your heart stopped beating, your brain synapses stopped firing, your lungs stopped breathing. That was what salvation was all about your eternal destiny. And maybe you grew up in a church that had a similar vision of salvation, or maybe you've wondered to yourself, why should I even bother thinking about this big, lofty theological term? I think the Gospel of Luke can give us a much wider, much more expansive imagination about what salvation might mean. And I wonder if we need this insight today, now more than ever. I don't know about you, but even as we're still living in these post-pandemic, mid-pandemic, pandemic is still around, but we're trying to do something different days, that the costs of the pandemic have been heavy among us. Certainly the people whose lives have been lost, the people whose dreams of their future lives have been taken away, people burnt out at their jobs. We have seen more and more the importance of being together, the importance of belonging. And I want to suggest that yearning that we have for belonging and this imagination in the Bible about salvation are tied up one with one another. So we turn to the scriptures not to avoid what's before us, the real challenges that we face, not as a distraction or an anesthetic, but because there's this radical commitment we share that in these texts we hear God's word for us. And in these texts we might just have our imaginations renewed, not just how we think, but precisely how we move through the world. So if we could have the next slide, I'm going to start with a strange place. I would like you to turn to your neighbor and share with your neighbor a story about the best meal you've ever had. So turn to a neighbor and share a story about the best meal you've ever had. I'm going to ask some of you all to share those stories here in a few minutes. So if you hear a really good story, elbow your partner and tell them that they should share their story. So share a story about the best meal you've ever had. Y'all ready? All right, start. And if you're watching online, maybe there's somebody nearby that you can text a story, or you can bring that story to mind. best meal you've ever had. All right. Hopefully both sides have gotten to share. Hopefully now you're not so hungry that you're going to stop listening to me for the next hour. The best meal you've ever had. So I would love to hear some stories. So if you'd like to share your story about the best meal you've ever had, I invite you to raise your hand. Pastor Katie's around with a microphone. You might need to encourage your neighbors because they told a really good story. So encourage them to share their story. The best meal you've ever had. You can see a hand back here and then one in the front as well. Did I see a hand? Yes? Awesome. Oh. The technology always works, y'all. It'll be okay.
When I was a student at LSU, my brother and I, we were students there together. We used to eat at this one restaurant that served a lot of Cajun food.
Oh, good. Yeah.
And so one night in the springtime, we saw several people with platters of crawfish. And I had never eaten anything like that before.
Uh-huh.
And so I told the owner that if he would show me how to eat it, I would order some.
Yeah.
And so he said he would, and so they brought me out a platter of crawfish. He took a crawfish and opened it, showed me how to eat it, and I've been a crawfish lover ever since.
Oh, I love that. It's a meal that you have to earn. It's like lobster or crab. Like you have to really get in there to earn it. I love that story. Thank you. And with your brother there as well. Yeah, I love that. Other stories, please.
Well, this was the best meal I ever ate. It probably was the most expensive meal we ever ate. Denny and I both thought of it immediately when you asked us.
Oh, wow.
And many, many years ago, we were on he was on a business trip. I got to tag along. We were in Italy and Switzerland, and his bosses said, "You have to eat at the Dolder Grand." And, he said, "So you go while you're there, we'll pick up the tab."
Wow.
So
Even better. Somebody else is picking up the
we
tab.
went, it was absolutely luxurious. I mean, waiters all over the place, taking care of our every need, delicious food, and we just felt,
I love that.
never happened again, probably never will, but we felt very spoiled.
Powerful. Thank you for sharing that story. And I think the best part is somebody else picked up the tab, of course, right? That's a very important detail to that story.
So one of the best places that we ever ate is a place called Joe T. Garcia's in Fort Worth. And the reason is that restaurant must be 70, 80 years old today. Remember, back in the day, literally walking through the kitchen to get to the dining room. That was the only way there. And then the health department got involved somehow. But
What could go wrong if you're walking through the kitchen? Yeah.
yeah, but Gene's mom and my dad both died 3 to 5 years ago. And up through there, we would still go to that restaurant, but it was all about not only the food, but it was always family.
Yeah.
And that's what was important, was the food and the family being there together. So.
Thank you.
And just the tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like it was what you all did over and over again. I love that. Any other stories? Oh, right there.
Well, I think my best meal that I ever ate was prepared by my mother. And that was because she would always ask me and my siblings on their birthday what we wanted to have for our birthday dinner. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, peas, and hot roast.
I'm coming over. Is that, after this,
And-
right? This is what we're doing, right?
And it's so funny you mentioned this because my siblings and I, in honor of our mother, who basically was the kitchen manager and the chef at Hammett House in Claremore, Oklahoma, are meeting there October 22nd to celebrate our mom, who is the best cook in
Oh, yeah.
Oklahoma.
Oh, yeah. Beautiful. I'm glad we made this official. Best cook in Oklahoma. We just discovered here. Awesome. Anybody else? I just want to make sure if anybody's dined. Monster pies at Hammond House, yeah. It's very important. Awesome. I love asking people this question to tell me about their favorite meals because there's these patterns I keep hearing over and over again. Oftentimes I'll hear stories about folks traveling, being in a new place. There's something about new places, places that we've never been before, places we may never get to visit again, and the way that food and place line up with one another and become this memorable moment for us. I often hear stories about trying new foods, like for this crawfish, right? This thing that you weren't quite sure even how to start eating, but when you do, then it becomes part of who you are. It gives you a sense of identity. I often hear stories about family, about people. It's interesting. So often when I ask people to tell me stories about their favorite meal, they don't start with the food, and they don't start with how the food tasted. They start telling me about where they were and who was with them, especially if those folks are no longer with us. I often hear those stories. Why start here? Well, because food isn't just food. Food and the meals that we share draw us together. Food and the meals we share give us a sense of our own identity. And I think it might tell us something, too, about the way that God has formed us. Food is more than just fuel for our bodies. And the reason I know this is because I've done this thing sometimes when I've had a busy day. I'm sure none of you have ever done this before, where you feel really busy, so you go through a drive-thru, and you pick up whatever in a brown bag, and you eat it in like 17 seconds, and your stomach is full, but you lost a little part of your soul in the process. Nobody else has done this, right? Because food isn't about just fueling our bodies. Food is about that connection we have with one another, that discernment of our identity, who we are, where we belong, and who we belong to. Food teaches us something vital about our identity before God. So we tell these stories because I think there's something in those stories that tells us something about God and about our imagination about salvation. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is derided because apparently he's a drunk and a glutton. He likes to drink too much and eat too much, which apparently is an insult, but for me makes me want to hang out with Jesus that much more. When I read the Gospel of Luke, it always makes me want to eat something because Jesus is always having these meals. Anybody see the show The Sopranos? This is here, I'm revealing myself. So in The Sopranos, Tony Soprano was always eating these delicious Italian cured meats. So whenever I watch The Sopranos, I want to eat. Whenever I read the Gospel of Luke, I want to eat something because Jesus is always sharing tables with others. And my theory is, my suggestion is, my argument is that sharing of food is not just a setting for the Gospel of Luke. It's not just a setting for Luke's Jesus to tell the stories he wants to tell, to say the things he wants to say, but that those very moments of eating are instantiations, they're embodiments of salvation. That those moments tell us something about salvation that simple words cannot communicate. So we can go to the next slide. I'll say more about this tomorrow, but just briefly here to say a little bit about the importance that the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles are stories, they're narratives. And notice I asked you to tell me a story about the best meal you've ever had and not to describe the menu, because I think there's something about stories that shapes us in a profound way. So again, I'll say more about this tomorrow, but very briefly, that I think the reason Luke chooses to tell a bunch of stories is because stories take over us in a way that mere instruction cannot. Luke could have just written a list of rules for how to be a good Christian, but doesn't do that. Instead, he chooses to tell all these very powerful stories that their meaning is sometimes elusive, that we have to chase after them, that we have to work through them to make sense of what these stories might tell us. And also because stories tell us who we are, and they teach us to have a different kind of imagination for the world. my sense is that left to our own devices, we look out into this world and we see a lot of death, a lot of loss, a lot of oppression. That we don't need an awful lot of help being able to see death and its power all around us, especially in the season coming out of the pandemic, but also in a season where we've wrestled with racial justice. It's pretty easy to see death everywhere we look. But to find life, we need help. And I wonder if this is one of the things that the Gospels can help do for us, is shape our imaginations and walk with us in a world full of death to help us see life in unexpected places. So let's turn first, we go to the next slide. The first story about food I want to take us to is in Luke chapter 7. So the text is up here, but if it's too small, there's also Bibles throughout that you can pick up. So Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 36. The story starts like this. One of the Pharisees asked Jesus to eat with him. So here it's important to note, as we'll talk about later, that Jesus often likes to eat, as I talked about this morning in the sermon, Jesus likes to eat with all the wrongest kind of people. But here Jesus is eating with the right kind of person, a Pharisee, a powerful person, a leader in their community. So this Pharisee asked Jesus to eat with him, and Jesus went into the Pharisee's house and took his place at the table. And a woman in the city who was a sinner, having learned that he was eating in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster jar of ointment. She stood behind him at his feet, weeping, and began to bathe his feet with her tears and to dry them with her hair. Then she continued kissing his feet and anointing them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw it, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what kind of woman this is who is touching him, that she is a sinner. So imagine this scene. The Pharisee in this nice house invites Jesus to eat with him. And this woman, who is everywhere known as a sinner, crashes this party. This woman has been maligned in the history of interpretation of this text. Because so many people, especially a lot of dudes along the way, have known why she is a sinner. And she's a sinner because we all know her name, right? Her name is Mary Magdalene, and she must be a sinner because she is a prostitute. Notice that nowhere here is her sin identified. Nowhere here do we learn the source of her reputation in this community. Instead, notice that the narrator tells us that she's a sinner, but Simon the Pharisee will confirm later the same, that she is a sinner. Now, what does that mean? As I talked about this morning, I think part of what's happening here is that sinner is a category for those people, for them, for people who don't belong. That it probably matters very little what she has done. What matters is that everybody knows, everywhere she goes, all her neighbors, all her friends, everybody in that community knows that everywhere she goes, she is a sinner. She doesn't belong. She's not one of us. And maybe there are rumors floating around about why she is a sinner. But what she did doesn't really matter. And Luke, notice, does not tell us what she did. All that matters is that she's not supposed to be there. She is a sinner. She doesn't belong. And notice what she does. She doesn't sneak into the party and try to hang out with Jesus and talk to him. Instead, she makes a big display of this lavish display of standing behind him and bathing his feet with her tears and drying them with her hair. Nobody could miss what was happening at this dinner party. And Simon the Pharisee says to himself, man, were a prophet, who he might have thought he might be a prophet, and that's why I invited him to my house. But now I know for sure he's not, because if he were a prophet, he would know who this woman is, someone who doesn't belong, someone who should not be at this dinner party. Maybe he's not the prophet some people say he is. And so the story continues, so if we can get the next slide. Jesus spoke up and said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And you should keep your head on a swivel. Whenever Jesus turns to you and says, I have something to say to you, something negative is coming your way. But here Simon says, teacher, he replied, speak. And Jesus, in a very Jesus move, begins to tell a story. A certain creditor had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debts for both of them. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon answered, I suppose the one for whom he canceled the greater debt. And Jesus said to him, you have judged rightly. Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? So Jesus confronts Simon with the story of two people who are carrying debts, and both of them are forgiven. And Jesus asks here to Simon, do you know who will love this person more? And he answers correctly, I suppose the one for whom he canceled the greater debt. But he turns to the woman and he says to Simon, do you see this woman? If we get the next slide. Do you see this woman? I don't want us to miss the power of this question. Do you see this woman? Because Simon does not see a woman. He sees a sinner. He sees someone who wasn't invited, someone who should not be at his table. And I worry, too, that so many interpreters of this story, so many preachers, so many teachers have also not seen this woman. They've only imagined what her profession was and what she did wrong. Too often we haven't seen this woman when we read this story, and here Jesus forces us to look at her full in the face and see who she is. The next slide, please. Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has bathed my feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which were many, have been forgiven. Hence, she has shown great love. But the one to whom little is forgiven loves little. Then he said to her, your sins are forgiven. But those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. So much happens here. Simon, do you see this woman? Simon, when I came to your house, you didn't do the things you were supposed to do when you invite a guest to your home. You didn't offer me a drink or take my coat. We lived in Minnesota for 7 years, and often, because there was so much snow in Minnesota, you'd come to somebody's house, you'd take off your snow boots, and they would offer you some slippers to keep your feet warm. You didn't offer me slippers, Simon. But here, this intruder, this sinner, this person that you have dismissed as someone who doesn't belong, has not stopped in this extravagant act of hospitality and welcome. And so Jesus says, her sins, which were many, have been forgiven. And I remember hearing the story in the church where I grew up, and what that meant is that one day this woman, who has all these neighbors who detest her, who don't want to be around her, that one day, when she died, she would be taken up into heaven. That was the shape of salvation. Your sins are forgiven. But there's got to be more than that in this story. There's got to be a bigger transformation at hand. Your sins are forgiven. It's striking that this woman never speaks in this story. She only speaks with her actions. So we might wonder, when is it exactly that she asked Jesus for forgiveness? When is it that in her activity, in what she did for Jesus, she sought Jesus' forgiveness? And I wonder when it happened is not when she's anointing Jesus' feet or covering his hair. It's not in that act. Because notice it says, therefore I tell you, for many have been forgiven. And then it says, hence she has shown great love. That her act of hospitality was her love towards Jesus, not the source of her forgiveness. I wonder when she sought forgiveness was when she took that courageous step to go to a place where she was not invited, to walk into a home where she was not welcome, when she dared to believe that Jesus was different than all her neighbors, that Jesus would see her as a daughter of God and not as yet another sinner. That courage, that persistence to believe that Jesus would be different is an act of seeking forgiveness, seek her deliverance from this weight of being called a sinner. And so when Jesus says to her, your sins are forgiven, I wonder if the transformation here is not just in her future, but in her present. Your sins are forgiven. Whatever it was that you did or didn't do, whatever it is that people said you did or didn't do, those things are now gone. And he turns to the community and says, basically, you can no longer call her a sinner. She no longer bears a big red S on her forehead or on her chest. She's no longer a sinner. She is one of you. She belongs here. That's the nature of her salvation. And the people are shocked by this. They say, who is this who even forgives sins? And a lot of interpreters think that that has something to do with Jesus acting too much like God, thinking that he can go around forgiving sins. I wonder if what they're really bothered by is that this stranger in this community, this Jesus, shows up and starts messing with our account of belonging. We know that she's a sinner. Who is this guy to tell us something that we know about her, something that we've all shared, something that we all know about her? Who is this who can even forgive sins, not so much as God, but to ask us to live differently? Who is this who's asking us to live life in a different way? And he says in the end, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. But I'm left wondering, what happened when Jesus left the scene? Did Simon and the other neighbors of this woman go right back to calling her a sinner? Or was her life so transformed and their imagination so transformed that she gained a new identity, that she gained a community, that she gained a place to live? I wonder too, earlier Jesus tells a story about these two people with great debts. And he asks Simon, who is it that will love the master more? Well, the one who is forgiven more. I wonder in the story, who is it that needs more forgiveness? The woman who is called a sinner, or the community that named her as such? Who is it that needs to change more? A second story. If you could switch the slides. Here, we're going to Luke chapter 9. So if you're following along in the text, Luke chapter 9, starting at verse 10. Right before this, Jesus has sent out the disciples in two to do Jesus things, to exorcise demons, to heal people, to preach the good news. And they come back to Jesus and they say, Jesus, you won't believe what happened. And Jesus is like, yeah, I know what happened. But they're so excited about the encounters that they've had. They come back and they tell Jesus all these marvelous things that have happened. And Jesus, as he often tries to do in the Gospel of Luke, tries to get away to pray, tries to re-energize, get away from the crowds, but the crowds find him. So starting in verse 10, the day was drawing to a close, and the 12 came to him and said, send the crowd away so that they may go into the surrounding villages and countryside to lodge and get provisions, for we are here in a deserted place. And here I want to dwell, the next slide, please. I want to dwell here on that line. We are here in a deserted place. In a moment, we'll learn that there are 5,000 men in this crowd, and an untold number of women and children as well. Notice the disciples look around and see all these people, and all they can see is a deserted place. They're there with Jesus. They've just gone out. They've been healing the sick. They've been exorcising demons. They've been preaching the good news. And they look around and all they see is what they do not have. And they forget who's with them. This Jesus who brings life wherever he walks. They look around and they see these thousands of people. They know what they've just experienced. They see Jesus before them. And all they see is what they lack. We are here in a deserted place. The story continues. Next slide, please. But he said to them, Jesus said to them, you give them something to eat. Which is not that extraordinary a request in light of what all the things they've just been doing, exorcising demons, healing people. But they missed the point. They said, we have no more than 5 loaves of 2 fish, unless we are to go and buy food for all these people. You can't possibly mean that, Jesus. That can't be what you're asking us to do. for there were about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, "Make them sit down in groups of about 50 each." They did so and made them all sit down. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. And all ate and were filled. What was left over was gathered up, 12 baskets of broken pieces. So here Jesus takes over. He has people sit into groups. They take what little they have, they share it, and the food multiplies. Luke says that all ate and were filled. Now, this is a common enough experience in our own world, but in the ancient world, very few people would have known what it would be like to be filled every day with food. Something like 80% of people's calories in the ancient world would come from bread and from olives. Meat would be quite rare in most people's diets. A lot of people were living on the very edge of subsistence, only having enough for that day. So when Jesus in the Lord's Prayer asks us to pray for our daily bread, that is quite literal in Luke's world. People work for today, for the food they will eat today. So this experience they have of eating and being filled must have been quite strange to them, quite unusual to them, especially here in this deserted place. And notice also that what was left over was gathered up, 12 baskets of broken pieces. And I worry that we miss something important about this part of the story. In a world where we throw away so much food, in a world where the food we throw away can feed the rest of the world, the problem we have isn't that we don't have enough food, is that we don't have it in the right place. Here, this is not a picture of excess. When my mom, who's the world's greatest cook, not in Oklahoma, but elsewhere, my mom cooks food often. She puts down one plate, and then there's a second and a third, and there's 17 plates all of a sudden, and we can't possibly eat all that food. And I say, "Mom, you made way too much food. This is going to go to waste." It's not that. Here, it's the sense that people eat, and they're filled, and there's still more left over. There's still more food where that came from. You didn't have to fight for the food. You didn't have to struggle for the food. It was there. And I wonder if for Luke and for Jesus in that moment, that experience, and for the people gathered there, that experience of being filled, of eating all that they want, and there's still more, was an experience of salvation. It was an experience of what salvation looks like and feels like in their bodies. And it's not just food for the day, it's food for eternity. A third story. Here we go to Luke chapter 19. The next slide, please. This famous story of Zacchaeus. Do you all teach the Zacchaeus song here? Is that something that you all are aware of? Can we sing it? I can't sing, so I can't help you with this, but can we start singing it? Zacchaeus was? Oh, louder, though, because I can't hear you. We all know this story. Jesus, beautiful job, everybody. So Jesus entered Jericho, and he's passing through it. And he was there, and he encountered a man named Zacchaeus. And we learned something about Zacchaeus right away. 3 different strikes against Zacchaeus. Number 1 is that he's a chief tax collector. We talked this morning about tax collectors and the reputation that they carried. That's strike number 1. Not only is he a tax collector, he's a chief tax collector. He's middle management. Strike number 1. Strike number 2, we find out that he's rich. And Luke often has less than generous things to say about those who are wealthy in this world. Moreover, we all know how tax collectors get rich, by taking advantage of their neighbors. So that's strike number 2. We find out strike number 3 in the next verse. See who Jesus was. But on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was short in stature. That's strike number 3. So in the ancient world, there is this sense that people's bodies are reflections of their moral value, and that short people are then also, there's something wrong with them, something askew with them. So that's strike number 3. It's a good thing we don't do this to each other anymore, right? Judge each other by the shape of each other's bodies, right? But Luke sets us up to see Zacchaeus as a villain in this story, this short, rich chief tax collector. So Zacchaeus ran ahead, climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and say, "He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." So if we can get the next slide, he has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Jesus, there are lots of good people in this community. Why are you hanging out with him and his family? Why are you hanging out with the short, rich chief tax collector when there's so many other good people in this community, Jesus? Why have you gone to be a guest of one who is a sinner? And the story continues here. If we can get the next slide. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." So the song tells us what happens, right? Zacchaeus was a bad guy, but when he has this encounter with Jesus, he becomes a good guy. He gives away half of his possessions. He fixes what he's broken, and we have the story. And then salvation has come to this house. But there's a little wrinkle to the story. So if you look where it says, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor," and later on, "I will pay back 4 times as much." The Greek text actually has those verbs in the present tense. So we could read his response in this way: "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I give to the poor. And if I defraud anyone of anything, I pay back 4 times as much." How does that change the story? This now is not a story of a bad guy who's turned into the good, but of someone who's always done the right thing. Half of my possessions, Lord, I already give to the poor. And if I mess up, if I do something wrong, I make up for it 4 times as much. What if this is not a story about Zacchaeus being transformed, but a story of a community whose perception of Zacchaeus is transformed? And in so doing, this community is brought back together. Notice what it says at the end: "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham." He is your brother, your cousin, your neighbor. He belongs here with you. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. And I wonder here if Zacchaeus is not who's most lost, but a community who has rejected Zacchaeus and is not the we that God has called them to be. Maybe Zacchaeus is not the one that needs to be transformed. Maybe it's everyone else around him. Next slide. Last story I would share, the last story about food, is the story of the road to Emmaus, which happens in Luke chapter 24. It's a famous story that you might have heard before, where these 2 disciples are leaving Jerusalem. They've been traumatized by seeing their friend hung up on a cross. They're fleeing because they might worry that they're going to be next, that they're the ones that Rome is going to go after next. So they run away from Jerusalem next to them, but they don't recognize Jesus. It says in Luke, their eyes were kept from recognizing him, which my English teacher would not love that sentence because it has a passive voice. We're not sure why they can't recognize Jesus. It could be that they're so deeply traumatized by their experience that they can't imagine is right in front of them. It could be that Jesus just looks different after the resurrection. Maybe he just has this glow about him that they don't recognize him. He could be wearing a Zorro mask. I don't know, because Luke doesn't tell us why they can't recognize him, but they don't recognize him. And they spend all day with Jesus. They walk next to him. Maybe they reach out to put their hand on his shoulder. They hear his voice. They smell him, his friend. And he teaches them all day. But they do not recognize him when he's teaching him. When he's teaching them. He doesn't recognize Jesus when they're walking alongside of him. They don't recognize him as they spend all day together. It gets to be the end of the day, and Jesus, it looks like he's going to keep on walking. I'm not sure where he was planning to go, but these two disciples insist, Jesus, stay with us. We will host you. And as Jesus is wont to do, he turns the tables on them, and instead of them hosting him, he hosts them. He takes bread and he breaks it, and their eyes were opened. Their eyes were not opened by his voice or his body or even his presence. Their eyes were open when Jesus does the most Jesus thing that Jesus does in the Gospel of Luke, is to take food and share it with his friends. But there's something characteristic about that activity of breaking bread and giving it to his friends. It's in that moment when they see Jesus, they recognize him for who he is. Food is powerful. And in Luke, food is a glimpse into what salvation looks like and even what it tastes like. My wife comes from an Italian family, and so they have this tradition of Sunday sauce. I don't know if you know about this. It's spaghetti and meatballs, right? But it's more than that, right? It's carefully made. It's long. The sauce takes all day to make. It fills the house with the odor of the aroma, and it's such a delicious food. And when I eat Sunday sauce with my wife, with my in-laws, with my kids, it feels like I'm connected to my wife and where she's from in a way that's really, really powerful. It feels like I'm a guest in her story, and I learn something more about who she is as I'm tasting this delicious food. And the love goes in both directions. So I grew up in Puerto Rico, and as you know, Puerto Rico has all the best food in the world, gandules and plantains. We all know this stuff, right? And she has learned how to make this food not just because it's delicious, but because it's a part of who I am. Food is this powerful point of connection. And I wonder, part of the imagination that Luke wants to stir in us is those stories that you shared earlier, those stories of those greatest meals you ever had, of being in a foreign place, a place you wouldn't have expected, of being with people you love, of eating with people who taught you who you are, made you who you are, that how you felt in that moment has something to do with God's salvation. In Jesus' first sermon, he sits down and he reads a text from Isaiah, and he says, "Today this has been fulfilled in your hearing." And over again, the word "today" comes up in the Gospel of Luke. We saw it in the story of Zacchaeus. Today, salvation has come to this house. And Luke, salvation is not for the future. It's for right here and right now. Salvation is not just about what happens when you die one day, but about your belonging here in this moment. And when God's grace falls upon you and upon your community, you are transformed in the moment. When you gather with those that you love, you taste a piece of God's salvation. I said this morning that if Luke only had one chapter's worth of papyrus, he would write Luke 15. So the story of a lost sheep, lost coin, the prodigal. I think if instead of one papyrus worth of chapter's worth of papyrus, if he only had one image to put before us, and if we go to the next slide, I think Luke would put before us a big table. And at that table, there are piles of food. Food that you love, food that your mother or your grandmother or your parent made for you, food that connects you to home. I think that's the image that Luke would put before us, this bountiful table. And not just that, you would sit at that table and people you loved would be there. And then there also would be at the table some weird-looking food that smells a little funny. But in that moment, you would not wonder what's wrong with that food. You would wonder, who is it that loves that food at this table? Who is at this table that food that's a little strange to me connects them to their home, to their family, to who they are? And the person sitting to your left and to your right would be eating strange food, and you would be drawn with curiosity to them, to their story, and to who they are. If Luke had one image, It would be this bountiful table with food that never runs out, that's delicious, and you feel filled. It's also a table where there's always one more chair. There's always space for one more, no matter how many people show up at this table. That's what salvation looks like. That's what salvation feels like. My friends, that's what it tastes like, too. Thank you very much. I think we have time for some questions, right? Yeah, so we have 10 minutes or so for questions, maybe 15. Questions, thoughts, your best recipes, anything you want to share with us this evening. Oh, in the back here, yes. We're going to put Pastor Katie to work. You need to get your steps in tonight.
It's not a question, just a reflection.
Please.
I have a Jamaican son-in-law and a South Korean daughter-in-law.
Wow.
And so the foods are varied and delicious.
Yeah.
But and that's really a good thing. So.
Yeah, and that there's something in trying someone else's food and being invited into that food culture that's not just, hey, let me try something new to eat, but they're inviting you into their sense of identity, into their family, into their connection. And when you find that when you love the food, you end up loving the people, I think there's critical insight there about the shape of God's creativity, the shape of God's grace. So it's a really important moment. So lovely. Thank you for sharing. Others, questions, thoughts, reflections?
Everyone's hungry.
I know, right? This is the problem with doing this around dinner time.
I think that's so true. When you asked the question for us to share with a neighbor, I said, oh, the La Posta restaurant in Las Cruces, Mexico. The atmosphere of the Mexican food is wonderful, but it really took me back to my mother, who is Mexican, and when we would be in Chihuahua City or in Del Mar, California, and my aunts and uncles, when we would come from Texas into Mexico, they will have killed a pig for the pork tamales and roasted the peppers and made the salsa, and my grandmother always had on her wood stove flour tortillas and corn tortillas fresh with a pot of pinto beans waiting for us, and my dad could eat
right through it. Right?
right through it. So, but you're right, it really takes you back to that experience of family.
Yeah. And I don't know about you, but I think in my case, when I think especially of the love I have for Puerto Rican food and the ways that various forces, from hurricanes to colonial forces to politics, have kept me away from that place and that land for various, I mean, I can visit and I can go back, but it's all very complicated. And I think that's often a common story among migrants in particular, too, the sense that we'd like to be connected to that land and to that food and to those places, but we can't for various reasons, often beyond our control. Now, you know, I don't know if this is the case here, I imagine it is, but if I go to the grocery store in Princeton, I can find all the food. Like, there's all the Goya products, and I can find all this stuff. But when we were younger, when we first moved to the States, you couldn't find plantains and gandules and all these other really important foods. So we would come back from Puerto Rico with boxes full of this food. Again, not just because we liked it, but because it was this connection to a place and a people. It was this little taste of salvation for us. So I think these stories are really vibrant and really important for us to share. So thank you for sharing that. Any others? Awesome. Well, thank you so much, friends. Thanks for coming out. Appreciate it.
Just as a reminder, we look forward to your talk tomorrow night. It's at 7 o'clock tomorrow night, a little bit later, so you can get back from work and come back over here tomorrow night. We so look forward to it. Keep telling those stories. sharing food. And I just wanted to say one thing. Coming out of the pandemic and we're gathering more together, we've been able to have meals together as a church family, a little bit more time together around food, and people have been expressing such gratitude for that, not taking it for granted. Thank you so much, Dr. Barreto. We'll see you tomorrow night. Thanks, everybody.